Right, welcome everybody, and welcome to this. It's basically a free and radical creative online series, and that we've got for the next couple of days, specifically for radical pioneers and thinkers as well. And I'm really excited to be hosting this wonderful session titled "How to Write Stories That Challenge Institutions" with the wonderful Adeyemi and Aditi Jaganathan. And just to kind of remind everyone that this session is being recorded, and if anyone's interested, that you can turn on the transcription, and if you need to, which is in the bottom on the it's next to the record button on the button in the bottom, so feel free to kind of click that button if you want live transcriptions. And just to introduce myself, my name is Majid. I am one of the non-executive directors at Tour Moon, founder and director of Union of Justice. And yeah, really thrilled to be joining everyone. Just to give everyone a quick reminder, if everybody, and apart from the speakers, can just put themselves on mute if you haven't done so already. We've got a chat box for everyone to kind of participate in and ask questions or whatever if people want to engage. And just to kind of give you a bit of a visual description of myself, I'm a black male and wearing a beige cap facing forward with a navy t-shirt. And yeah, I'm basically going to hand it over and get one of our speakers to introduce themselves. And we've got the wonderful Abraham and Adeyemi. Abraham, first and foremost, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure. If you can visually introduce yourself as well as verbally, and basically just a short description of yourself and where you are at the moment.
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, everyone. I am Abraham Adeyemi. I am a black man, got a beard here, a bit of hair there, wearing a navy blue hoodie that says Picante, it picks up a bit, and I'm in my flat in southeast London. So yeah, nice to be joined with you guys, and yeah, should be a fun hour or so talking.
Amazing. Yeah. And is Aditi here? Aditi, are you there? No, not to worry. When Aditi joins, we'll get her to introduce herself. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to hand it over to the wonderful Abraham to kickstart us for us. So he'll be basically going to be speaking for roughly about 20 minutes, and then we'll hand it over to Aditi. And then we're going to go straight into Q&A, so feel free to take notes. But just before we do that, I must not forget. And I just want to, let me just share my screen 1 second. I'm sure you guys would have all got the memo by now, but we have got this amazing funding opportunity. I think it's around about £1 million, which we're offering to young people to do a host of things, basically. So you can go to tourdemoon.com/apply. So it says, get funding to make a new creative project and feature in the festival. So you can literally do all sorts of things. You can create an immersive film, which will give up to £25,000 to. You can make a short film for get £3,000. You can get involved in like the Moon Hotline. You can like write things, Moon Experience. You can perform. If you're a DJ, you can submit towards the magazine. There's literally a host of great opportunities. So please, guys, do have a check and have a look into that. And if you think it's not for you, you know, you may have some friends who might be interested, but it's a real great opportunity to, in order to just give some money to young people to do some amazing, cool stuff, and that can in return be part of the festival. So yeah, we've got £1 million to kind of give out to young people. So it doesn't matter where you are. And yeah, so definitely check that out. But yes, I'm going to now stop sharing my screen. If I can, there we go. Yeah, I'll hand it over to the wonderful Abraham. Over to you.
Amazing, cool. Hi guys. I guess I should give a brief introduction about myself. So I'm a screenwriter, director, and playwright. Although these days I like to refer to myself as a retired playwright. The last full-length play I wrote was in 2019, and I've been spending all my time since then writing for screen and directing it as well. So I started off in 2011 writing for screen. Then in 2014, I think, I decided to start writing theatre, just because the situation in the UK, it was very clear that a lot of the new talent in screen that was getting the kind of opportunities that I wanted to get were actually coming from theatre. And so just to be a bit more strategic, I was like, fine, let me try and write some theatre and see how that goes. And hopefully that will open doors for me in screen, which it finally did do in 2019. I'm giving a very condensed version of this because I want to get onto actually everything I'm meant to talk about. I made a short film in 2019 called No More Wings, which some of you may have seen. It wasn't the first short film I'd written, but it's the first one I directed, and I'd never had any intentions or ambitions to direct whatsoever. But I won a screenwriting competition, and the rules were whoever wrote that film also had to direct it. And so I didn't have a choice. I had to learn how to direct in about 12 weeks. And thankfully it went well. It got selected for Tribeca Film Festival, which is an Oscar and BAFTA qualifying festival. It then ended up winning Best Short Film at Tribeca. And this was all in the middle of the pandemic, so there was no physical festival. And it got selected for about maybe 15 more festivals, the majority of which were BAFTA and Oscar qualifying. It won, I think, 2 or 3 more awards. And it really changed my career, and things just absolutely propelled. And I guess why I start with that film actually is because I think it's an excellent place to start with how to write stories that challenge institutions and talk more about the experience of what that was like for me. Part of my journey is that in 2015, I started up my own production company called Creative Blue Balls. And the reason why I started that company was from a place of frustration, as the name kind of suggests, and knowing that, you know, I had all these stories I wanted to tell, and I was just really frustrated that I wasn't being given the spaces to make them. So I'm submitting them to theatres, I'm submitting it to production companies and film and TV, and people like my writing, but the work isn't being made. And the next question I ask myself is like, okay, well, maybe it's that I just need to put something on, because I'm convinced and I'm confident that this work is good enough, but maybe people can't see it on the page and they need to see it out loud and in person. And so, you know, I'm not going to pretend that starting up your own company is the easiest thing. And I don't come from a particularly privileged background, you know, single parent household, working class, grew up on this estate. And actually, at the time when I made this decision, I was also homeless. I was couch surfing from house to house for about 2 years. But the big thing for me was just being sure that, you know, I could see the mathematics of how I could do this. So in film and TV, if I wanted to make a short film for screen, the budget would have to be significantly higher than it would be for something for theatre. And I couldn't show how I could make the money back. Whereas with theatre, it was pretty straightforward to me. I was like, okay, right, well, if I get a venue which seats, let's say 200 people, or this one actually, it seated, I think 150. So I was like, right, get a venue that seats 150 people, have a show for 2 nights. If tickets are, let's say, £10, that's £3,000. That's a £3,000 budget for us to do something. This also relied on my confidence in that we'd sell out the tickets, which we ended up doing. But actually, the crazy thing I did is that I didn't charge a fixed price for tickets, but it still works out. I did pay what you want, and I think that just comes down to kind of my character and the kind of person who I am, and reflecting on my own life experiences, where there were often times in life during my, you know, at that point I was 4 years into my journey, but throughout my whole 10-year journey minus the year and a half, there's always been many points where I've wanted to support people and I couldn't afford to do it, but I knew my heart was in the right place. And I just thought to myself that it'd be so sad if someone who had been so supportive to me was not able to attend this showcase of 3 short plays of mine just because they couldn't afford it. So I was like, right, well, everyone can afford £1. So those who can only afford £1 will pay £1, and those who can afford more will pay more. And then it turned out that our average ticket sales were maybe 7 or 8 quid. And we ended up breaking even, and that was all great. But for me, again, what having my own company did for me was it very early put me in a position where I was able to trust my own instincts, and I wasn't relying on establishments and institutions telling me that, you know, your story is good or your story isn't good, or you need to do this, you need to do that. It was simply me relying on, do you know what? I've got this story and I reckon it's a good play. I'm going to write it and we're going to make it, and I'm just going to trust my gut. In the same way how in civilization, you might have memorable moments in life that you decide to tell a friend, and you decide to tell a friend because you think, yeah, this is interesting or this is funny and something in your life. Yet somehow we've ended up with all these kind of, I don't know what the word is, pressures of what makes good storytelling and what isn't, and it's being determined by institutions. And so equally with my film No More Wings, I wrote a short film, 10 minutes long. And at this point, yes, it did need to be decided by someone else that it'd be great and that it deserved the money that it ended up receiving. But for me, when I did, that was a film idea I'd had for 4 years. And I talked to many people about this film. And yeah, I always say, but I think as a premise, it's very basic and very uninteresting and unexciting. And annoyingly, like, it's not something you can really pitch without spoiling it. And yeah, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's not seen it. Just go on YouTube. If you type in No More Wings, it's probably the first thing that comes up. It's got about 2.5 million views. But in that creative process with the company, which was Soho House, which is a private members club, once they awarded us the funding, they said, right, here's your money, here's your deadline, go and make your film, which is not how this industry works at all. Like, most funding bodies, they're going to meddle all the way through, like, oh, you should change this, you should change that, oh, write another draft, do this, do that, do this. And to fast forward to present day, where this film has been so successful and the way that people talk about its success, I find it almost ridiculous, because people talk about how refreshing it is. And I'm not doubting that that's true, but I also look at it and think, why can't you guys identify why this is refreshing? Because the reason why it's refreshing is because it's not been made in the way that so much work is often made, where people meddle, especially with new talent, you know, emerging talent, when you're just at the beginning of your career. Like, if you're I don't know, Tarantino or whoever we want to name, you know, they're given so much freedom because everyone trusts their work, they trust their voice. But at this point with newer people, it's just so much more difficult. And so that was kind of what I wanted to start with, which I didn't even plan. And just as I was introducing myself, I was like, yeah, I think that would probably make sense to talk about. But when I was asked to speak about this and talk about writing to challenge institutions, the first thing I thought was that I don't think I ever personally start my writing process with the thought of challenging institutions at the forefront. It's not something that ever comes to my mind. All I'm ever trying to do is write stories that I want to tell. And that's why I encourage everyone else to do, like, what are the stories you want to do and you want to tell? And I think potentially that in itself is a form of challenging the institutions, because often people begin to, you know, ask themselves and think, what does the industry want to see? But the problem with thinking about what does the industry want to see, so a great example, whether we're talking about I May Destroy You or Normal People, or all these hugely successful shows of this year, these are shows that the productions or development would have started 3 or 4 years ago. So if you're watching I May Destroy You or Normal People in 2020 or 2021 and thinking, yeah, that's what the industry wants to see, well, actually, by the time your idea that you thought of today, the industry is in a completely different place in 3 or 4 years. So actually, it's not about trying to predict based on what is currently in front of you, what the institutions want to see. I think personally, the challenge in itself is writing things that you just simply want to write and trusting your gut. Again, bringing it back to No More Wings, it was a story that I came up with, about 4 or 5 years ago, but its moment finally was in 2019. And I never doubted that it was a good story. The only difference was, in the moment when I had it, it wasn't the right moment, it wasn't the right circumstances, maybe it wasn't the right story to tell. And that takes me on to my next thing I want to talk about, which is, I think as a Black man, I choose to write stories that I consider to be universal, albeit they often either have Black people at the center, like the protagonists are Black, or the layers of nuances are often relating to Blackness and my experiences as a Black man. But I think I say all of that, but then I think I write stories that aren't conventional in terms of what comes from that environment. It's not the stereotypes that we often see depicted. But on top of that, I would say I'm completely unafraid to write stories that don't have Black protagonists. Like, for me, at the heart of everything I'm telling, it's universal stories. And maybe part of my form of challenging the institution, which is something that's definitely subconsciously come along in my journey, is that I'll be like, right, this is a story that could be about anyone, whether it's a white person, whether it's an Asian person, a Black, whatever it is. And I make the specific decision that, oh, actually, no, I'm going to make this character Black, because if I don't do it, actually, who is going to do it? I've been on this planet for 30 years and I've seen enough movies that I absolutely love with majority white characters. And I don't question that because I enjoy those films. And that's actually all I care about, is enjoying the stories. But actually, there's a big problem there, but we're not seeing stories where it could have been played by anyone, and yet they're all majority white. And so I think that in itself is a form of challenging institutions, when you question why are we not seeing stories which are universal but can be with non-white people and non-white characters. And so I think that's a form of challenging institutions and things to consider in your writing. I remember a few years ago, I was writing a film, and it was, the two protagonists were male, and a producer came on board and he was like, have you ever thought of changing those two characters to female? And I was like, no, I haven't actually, but it would completely work. And equally, I wrote a play a number of years ago, which is again about two guys. And someone said to me, would you consider changing one of those characters to a woman? And there wasn't a single line of dialogue that changed, which maybe speaks to how I write in terms of what I'm talking about, universal stories and things which we can all relate to and connect to. But I guess for me, it's now to say to us as storytellers and creatives to also challenge ourselves in our writing. And rather than write 10 or 100 versions of the same story with the same type of characters, to ask ourselves, why can't that person be a woman? Why can't that person, instead of being heterosexual, why can't they be gay or a lesbian or whatever it is? How does this change, whether it's black, whether it's white, all the different spectrums of diversity, and asking yourself what could be different. And I think absolutely the nuances are still important, and you need to have nuance in your stories. I cringe whenever I watch something where it's very clear that the character was written, I guess, without any consideration of who they are, where they've come from, what their life experiences are, and having those details, because those details are important. But I think you can at least form, I guess, a framework of who a character is without those nuances, and then maybe you start to throw them on as you develop the story. The next thing, let's see. Coming back to a point I made earlier, which was about me being unafraid to write stories that are not with Black protagonists. I think something that's been discussed a number of over the last few years is, whenever there's, at least in film and TV, whenever there's a story that is written by a white person and it's a non-white story, there often is critique leveled at these stories, and in terms of allowing other people to tell someone else's story, a different culture and community. And it's something that I've always actually disagreed with, because again, I just want to watch great movies, great TV shows, great films, but also as a storyteller, I personally want the liberty to be able to write those stories if I want to. And so actually, the problem isn't that white people are writing stories that aren't about white people or about other cultures. It's that actually the privilege is not afforded in the opposite way around, which is Black writers and Asian writers and so on and so forth are often not even told, but it's just an assumption that they can't write these stories. But one of the biggest Netflix series from the UK, Top Boy, is written by a 60-something-year-old, I think Ronan is, Northern Irish. But what did he do? He lived in Hackney for a number of years, lived on an estate, and I've read interviews where he says, I know all of those characters, I've met them, which is why he's able to write a show that's pretty authentic. And I tell people, if you want to write stories which are not your own experiences, that's fine. But you've got to, that statement is true where people say, write the stories but the bit they always miss out is that you can also write the stories that you're prepared to research, because by researching or studying, that is how you will come to know the stories. On this topic, as I was preparing, I just thought to myself, last week in the UK, a film came out called Boxing Day. And Boxing Day is a Black British Christmas movie, and it's a rom-com. And it came out last week Friday, so the 3rd of December 2021. And that is the first Black British Christmas movie in history. And that is absolute lunacy to me. But it comes again of what I'm saying about how we're challenging institutions, that this is what we need to do. Me and my best friend have a running joke where we talk about our favorite movies with white characters, and we're just like, you know what? we should actually just recreate all these storylines, name them something else, and put Black people instead. Because mute. Cool. I think I was muted for a second. No idea what happened. Anyway, yeah, we have this ongoing joke about telling, creating stories which essentially are films that we all love. So whether it's Home Alone, The Breakfast Club, Bonnie and Clyde, whatever, is like, yeah, rename it something else, change a few bits, make it non-white people. And all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, this film's so refreshing and breathtaking. Actually, no, it's not. It's stories that have always existed, but we've never seen them with diversity in them. So I think that was the point to make. And the last few things I'm going to wrap up on are, firstly, I asked myself whether I could truthfully do this lecture about how to write stories that challenge institutions, because I wasn't sure if I could. I was like, well, I don't ever think about that when I'm writing, but perhaps as an artist and as a filmmaker and as a storyteller, fundamentally we're almost always challenging institutions anyway, because aren't we just always trying to create what we can't see? And yeah, I think I encourage everyone to just simply say what they want to say with their work and be unafraid of creating what doesn't already exist. There's two more points I think I have. Here we go. I'm just going to read this out exactly what it says. It says, just thinking out loud, I think something that's important and that's been on my mind a lot recently is that Black or ethnic minority or global majority, whatever you want to call it, apart from BAME, because I hate that term, but the art doesn't need to be 10 out of 10 to be a success. And I think that is also an important aspect of challenging the institutions, because for so long, artists who are non-white, which is probably my favorite term to use of all of the ones, whether it's BAME and this, and I think actually just call it what it is and let's stop being afraid, because that's exactly what we mean. We mean non-white. I think for so long, there's been an expectation of either they make perfect work or they never get an opportunity again. And actually, I don't need as a lover of film and TV, I don't need everything I watch to be 10 out of 10. For those who are not from the UK, there's a British soap called EastEnders, which I've watched religiously for 23 years of my life, I think. I've not missed a single episode, I shit you not. And that is like, there's probably 5 good episodes a year, and it's 4 episodes a week. And I'm happy with that. I'm never going to complain. This is what, I enjoy that. So if I don't have these expectations of anything, like whether it's I'm watching a Marvel film, whether, there's different levels and variety to film and TV, then why should we expect that of work from non-white people? Why does it need to be a 10 out of 10? There's the same way there is space and room for mediocre or average or just simply not critically acclaimed work in the white canon of storytelling. So it should be the same in non-white storytelling. So yeah, I think that's everything that I've got on challenging institutions. And when we eventually get to the question and answer it in 20 minutes, I'm sure I can say more that might be of help to people. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Abraham.
You're welcome.
Wow, so much to unpack from there. Speaking of EastEnders, I remember when Tiffany got pushed down the stairs in 1998. I remember that being a big moment in my household to remember. But honestly, thank you so much. And guys, we are very excited to have the wonderful Aditi join us. Aditi, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good, thank you. Now I can't stop thinking about who shot Phil Mitchell.
Glad we're all thinking about EastEnders now.
Honestly, Aditi, and thank you very much for joining us. What would be great is if you can kind of visually describe yourself, introduce yourself, the work that you do, and then basically we'll just go straight into you.
Yeah, it's so hard, sometimes to like describe oneself in like a bite-sized little snippet. But I'm Aditi, and I wouldn't say that I'm a conventional storyteller or writer. I think I kind of dance with writing and fiction in my practice as an educator. and I write a lot of academic texts, which many people might consider to be dry and dense. But what I do try to do is I try to inject opacity. I try to inject poetry. I try to inject the radical imagination within an academic context, which isn't very popular, you know, because I guess when you work within an institution, there's an institutionalized way of doing things, and consciously or unconsciously, we internalize that institutionalization. But there's something really powerful about kind of breaking free, you know, about kind of finding openings within yourself and using those kind of pores of openness to create. And very similar to what you were saying, I don't, when I engage in any kind of creative work, whether that be writing or teaching, the institution isn't necessarily like within my consciousness or my unconscious, actually. And I think there's something quite problematic about when we kind of use the institution or challenging the institution as a point of departure for the work that we do. Because by orbiting the institution, even if we're doing it in an anti kind of, in a rupture or eruptive kind of context, the institution is still at the center of our thinking, and it's still at the center of our kind of matrix of creativity. And what I kind of pose to you all is, what kind of work can we create if we turn away from the institution, if we don't center it, if we kind of rupture it through imagining what exists outside of the institution? And I think this kind of connects, you know, in some ways with what Abraham was saying about, you know, those stories in the everyday, you know, the things that kind of give us life. The ways in which we resist without even thinking about resistance as this kind of concept or construct. And I think that's what we're drawn to. Ultimately, we're drawn to narratives that kind of flesh out what it is to be human, what the human condition is, the nuances and the complexities of what makes this life, you know, beautiful and blessed, but also what makes it a struggle at times, you know. And when you were talking as well, Abraham, I was thinking about Sylvia Wynter, because you were talking about how so very often, I think within the colonial imagination, humanity and the human condition has been kind of, you know, orbiting around whiteness to such a degree that kind of Black subjectivity and brown subjectivity as well, to a similar degree, is kind of severed from what it is to be human. Like there's a total kind of disassociation. And that's why whenever we see the kind of peppering of narratives pertaining to kind of Black subjectivity, brown personhood, we think that the work is exciting, right? Just because of the mere presence of those subjectivities, even though the work might not be that great, right? And like you said, it's okay if the work is not great, but also we need to kind of push beyond mere presence. Do you know what I mean? We need to kind of push beyond the kind of representation of Black and brown narratives in creative and cultural spaces. And we need to think about, well, in my mind, we need to think about what liberation looks like, you know, and how can we kind of create narratives that kind of dance around this idea of Black liberation, the liberation of like people across the global South, international, you know, liberation. These are things that kind of animate my kind of spirit. And very often these are narratives and stories that don't get funded, right? Because people don't want to talk about this stuff, let alone see this stuff kind of audiovisually represented. Like just the other day, I was rewatching an incredible film made by a Guadeloupean filmmaker called Sarah Maldador. And she was one of the first Black women to make a feature film. And all of her work is like stunningly radical. And it speaks to revolution and radical kind of political action from the lens of Black women, but also from the lens of the everyday, right? So revolution isn't just this kind of militant dismantling of all these kind of insuperable structures of power, but revolution can be seen in the everyday. It can be seen in tender moments that we share with the people that we love. And there's a really, really beautiful moment in this film where we see the protagonist and her husband with their little child just laying in bed together, like resting. And there's a real palpable stillness in that moment. And I was really struck by like the kind of beauty of this scene, and also by how rarely we get to witness that stillness when it comes to you know, Black narratives and Black voices within the kind of audiovisual context. And this was someone who made this work like in the 70s, right? And yet we don't necessarily, and by we I mean like maybe we in the kind of mainstream, right, we in the global north, we don't necessarily engage with this work because it's work that the institution doesn't present. So we have to search for the narratives that kind of feed us in some way. And then I think, you know, a lot in my mind, when we think about writing and when we think about creating, it doesn't only come from us kind of, you know, doing the work of writing literally or creating in a literal sense, and even in a metaphysical sense, but what happens before we write? Where do our ideas come from? And I think, like you were saying, Abraham, about like research, you know, how do we research with care? You know, how do we employ an ethic of care, even when we're talking about our communities, right? Like there's still a level of care that we need to show the people who we're writing about. And also, I think you were saying something about how the people that we're engaging with within our stories, within the fictions that we weave together, they have complex worlds that we're not always privy to within that work. And I think some of the best written work, and also I guess written work that then gets translated audiovisually, is work that captures that nuance, is work that captures that tenderness. So you know that there's something behind what this person is saying to you. And I think the beauty of work that does that is that it stirs something within you that compels you to engage with people in your day to day with that much more complexity, you know. And you know, you might have a kind of argument with someone, like a friend or a partner, and as opposed to kind of just being reactive and responding directly to what they've said to hurt you in that moment, thinking about the complexity of what kind of led them to utter that kind of contemptful statement, you know. And it's obviously it's hard, but I think the best art kind of plants seeds of transformation within you. The best art is sincere art, and I think you use the word authenticity, Abraham, you know. And I think, you know, we need to, as opposed to kind of looking externally, looking to institutions, looking to other writers maybe even too, like what does it mean to create work from our internal landscapes? You know, what does it mean to traverse within ourselves deeply? And what does it mean to then create from that space? And I think we all know, you know, that, you know, whether it's EastEnders or whether it's, you know, some avant-garde film from the 60s, we know the work that moves us comes from that place, you know. So I would kind of really encourage you to kind of explore your internal worlds. And there's a really beautiful writer, his name eludes me, but he writes about the internal landscape, the internal landscapes of Black people, and he talks about the power of interiority, and how very often when it comes to, you know, the representations and narrativizations of Black and brown people, we don't necessarily get to engage with those internal spaces. And I think there's a stillness and there's a beauty and almost an alienation when we dance with those interior spaces. But there's also something quite kind of, there's an opening as well, you know, and there's a moment of connection. when we get to kind of dive into those deeper places and spaces. So I guess ultimately what I'm kind of trying to say is that don't frame the institution within your writing, you know, turn away from it, return your gaze to yourself, actually. And that's not indulgent. Do you know what I mean? You know, some people equate this kind of centering of self with a kind of a notion of indulgence, but actually, you know, there's an inextricable connection between who we are and all the systems of power that we've internalized, and the external worlds and the communities and universes of people that we belong to in the present and the past. And we have to do that deep work within ourselves to be able to presence those voices, to be able to presence that plurality and multiplicity. So yeah, I think that's all I have, people.
That's more than enough. That is more than enough, Aditi. Thank you so much. Wow, so much to get through. And yeah, so we've got 20 minutes left. We'll go straight into Q&A. Guys, if anybody wants to go into just wants to kind of unmute themselves or raise their hand. Does anybody want to ask a question at all? Or if you want, you can also put it in the chat box and I'll be able to ask your question. But feel free to come off mute and ask a question. And Samantha?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I had this question for Abraham. Thank you both for your talks. Really, truly inspiring. Abraham mentioned that he started his production company, and I was wondering, like, it never occurred to me. Also, like as a story, like a writer, and wanted to do small films with my friends. I was wondering, like, what are the advantages of having a production company, and also the challenges that you face with this adventure?
Well, I can answer that. Firstly, thank you for the question. Secondly, something that I'm pretty sure I omitted from that story about starting the company. So I know I spoke about bits of it, which was I said to myself, right, I can, if I invite this amount of people and sell this amount of tickets, then this is the budget we'll have, blah, blah, blah. I said all of that. One bit I omitted is that doesn't change the fact that I would have had to pay for things upfront. And I had two friends who I've grown up with, known them since I was like 5 years old, who had just sold like 10% of their company or whatever, like a startup. So they had like a windfall of cash. And I just said to them, look, I want to do this thing. And they're like, yeah, okay, we'll give you some cash and pay us back when it's done. And that was, you know, I always say that there's little things in my journey which I think are important to identify as privileges. And that's definitely a key one, to say that I had friends who could give me £2,000 or £3,000 or whatever it was, or lend me rather, so that I could be able to do this thing. Now, in terms of the advantages and challenges of starting up your own production company, I don't advise many people to do it, if I'm honest. It's because there's so much that unless you have that experience, you just don't know. Like, I've made a million mistakes, whether it's like tax related stuff, whether, you know, all of these things which are really difficult, and you kind of just have to learn along the way unless you've studied it or got the experiences. The advantages are, I think the advantages align with what your goals and ambitions are. So for me, there's a bigger picture of my journey and of what I want to do in my career, which is so much more than just me. And it's about essentially recreating my own success for other writers. And in doing that, I'm like, well, okay, if I want to do that, it needs to be under an umbrella of some sort. That umbrella is the company. The company's called Creative Blueboards, where all of a sudden in 5 or 10 years, you've now got this, all these things which I've been a part of, but putting other people up on another platform. So I think that's an advantage. I think also another advantage is in terms of, and this is probably more related to film and TV, is ownership and credits and what you're afforded as a result of that. You know, I can't say for sure that I knew this at the time when I was doing it, but certainly now when I'm going into TV deals and some of my film deals, like, yeah, the credits I'm getting are not necessarily the same credits that people at a similar level or similar stage of their career are getting. But part of that is built on the foundations of because I was producing my own work. And so it's almost or for me, it's an expectation, it's a standard that I expect, but also I think it's hard for companies to challenge that because there's a catalogue of seeing that, right, he's actually always been heavily involved in his work beyond just the actual writing and directing and the creating of it. He's been highly involved. I don't know how well that answers your question, but I think more importantly than anything of having your own company, whether you do or you don't, actually the most important thing there was just making my own work. And I think that's maybe the biggest takeaway. And by no means is making your own work easy. Like especially for screen, I think it's a lot easier for theatre because you can easily see how the numbers can add up and how you can make it back. Whereas with screen, it's just, it's astronomically expensive to make screen off your own back.
I didn't get that.
Oh, Apple Watch is talking and getting involved.
No, I did get that. So thank you so much. That's really helpful advice. And I think these goals and ambitions that you mentioned really, gives me some compass to think about or something. So thank you for sharing your experiences.
No problem. Happy to help.
Has anyone got any other questions at all or comments? Aditi. Hello, are you still? Oh, there you are, sorry. Just a quick question, Aditi. In terms of, I guess, in your abundance of experience that you've got, basically, in terms of, I guess, with the institutions that you've worked in or you've worked for, that you've just engaged in whatever capacity, basically, are there any, I don't know if you want to name names or whatever, is there any that you kind of thought that have been really, that you've kind of thought that you kind of worked well with, or you kind of like didn't necessarily work well with, and what you kind of learned from that, basically?
So it's quite interesting because my kind of like work with and within institutions, I think comes from my attitude, in a way, comes from Fred Moten and Stefano Hani's The Undercommons. And they basically say, use the institutional space, use the resources within that space, and give it to spaces and communities and people who don't necessarily have access to those resources. And so in any way or shape that I can, that's what I kind of endeavor to do, to use the networks within those spaces, to use the resources within those spaces, to render those who don't have access to those resources in some way, to kind of dance with those resources. So there's a kind of a distribution, a kind of little socialist utopia going on. But also, I think within any institution, if we kind of break down what the institution is, obviously the institution is composed of different dynamics of power intersecting and interacting with each other in lots of different ways. But the institution is primarily composed of people, right? In our complexity, in our fullness, in our abundance. And you are going to have your champions, right, within any kind of institutional space. So something that I guess I would advise people to do is find out who are your people within those institutional spaces and use that, right? I remember a law professor say to me, she was a human rights defender for Amnesty International, and we were talking about like the tensions and contradictions of being a human rights defender and working within or with governments. And she was saying how like sometimes you need to think of your work as being like an ecosystem, and there being like different people in different kind of contexts, different spaces, different settings, who are supporting your agenda and who are fighting with it from within. And that's not necessarily a tension, because that's how change happens, right? Little echo chambers kind of spreading and igniting change in different spaces and places. And so I guess we kind of live in a world where we need to kind of engage and interface with institutions to get shit done, so I guess in a creative way, we can kind of turn away from the metaphysical gaze of the institution, but we can also use the institution on our own terms, right? So if we kind of reorient ourselves to the notion of power, if we think of institutions as holding all the power, then we're always at a loss, right? Whereas if we kind of see ourselves as these kind of agents of change and creativity who embody power in a different way, then our kind of dialogue and discourse with the institution is going to be different. It's going to be coming from a different place. Like you have a lot to gain from us, actually. So it kind of reframes the power. So yeah, I guess, you know, I hope you don't think I'm deterring you to like engage with institutions. I think what I'm trying to say is you can be clever and creative about the ways in which you choose to engage and interact with the institution.
Definitely. And I think I remember with some of the university's underground students, one of their tasks was that they had to actually engage with an institution. And one of the points we're trying to get across is you don't have to ask for permission to be able to engage with an institution. Because a lot of people kind of feel as if, like, no, we have to ask permission, like, can we work? No, it doesn't have to be like that whatsoever, basically. Has anybody got any questions? Has anybody else? Just put it on kind of review. And feel free to put a hand up. I'll just start speaking or put a question in the chat box. If not, I've got a question for 1 minute. And Aisha goes, can we go back in time and listen to this again? Yes, we can, Aisha. Don't worry, this will be available on all media.
I'm so sorry. It was so good. So good. So good.
It definitely will be available on YouTube. But if you've got a question or a comment, yeah, no worries. I was going to say, and Abraham, because I appreciate you kind of touched upon the difficulties of starting up your own and especially not done one before, and the importance of having that network or just people that kind of just support you because you come to, I guess, realize that you can't do everything by yourself. Hard work alone doesn't get you anywhere. There needs to be sacrifice, opportunities and everything. But I guess what would be, I guess, if you could go and tell yourself when you were thinking of starting this, like, I know there's like you said, there's a million mistakes you kind of made, but if there was, like, say, your top two, or like, even like just one crucial thing, because the reality is I'm sure there's many people are going to be watching this that are thinking, who am I to set up my own company? I don't know anybody. Like, I don't even know the first thing, but it can be done. And I think you're a great example of, yes, it is difficult. Yes, there are going to be shitloads of mistakes along the way, but it is possible. But I don't know, like, if there's just one, even if there's any like resources online or just like any sort of, just one kind of thing that you would tell yourself at the start that would have been really worthwhile.
I mean, I think the difficulty is that a lot of the things that might come to mind that I would have told myself at the start aren't things that I didn't already know at the time. The only difference is that they weren't accessible or they weren't available. So, for example, even to this day, I still dream of having a business partner who is solely just about the business stuff, nothing creative, just they can handle all of that stuff. And I'm sure that will come one day. But yeah, that's at this moment, I still do everything. Like I stay on top of all of those things. And I think that's probably the most difficult thing with so much of these creative endeavors especially when you mix in the entrepreneurial side of things, is that in reality, you need 10 people to do 10 jobs, but actually it's one person doing 10 jobs. And you just have to push through and persevere. And, you know, I always say that there's never anything I say I'll change. You know, I think everything has contributed to a part of my journey and made me who I am and so on and so forth. And you know, there's lots of positive things in terms of who I am. And yeah, I know that I've always had certain qualities like being really determined and driven and stuff like that. So I don't see how this would have happened. Like anything that would have happened differently is all external things that I can't control, and everything that I could control, I did my best with and made the best of it. So yeah, that's my answer.
Amazing, thank you. And just before we wrap it up, and I'll just give Aditi first and Abraham, if there's any things that you wanted to plug, is anything that you're working on, or if anybody can, I guess, just reach out or just see some of your works or if there's anything that you wanted to share, basically. Aditi?
So there's a lot to share, but it's more like a watch this space. So there's a lot of stuff like happening in the kind of ethereal, ephemeral, creative ether. So I kind of want to make my PhD accessible to everyone. It's 100,000 words long, so it's it might take a while to read, but I want to basically make like an audiovisual accompaniment to the PhD. So hopefully at some point next year, I'm going to be breathing that into being. And also I'm going to be doing my 6th season of a course that my partner my partner and I devised together called Rhythm Race Revolution, which looks at the eruptive sonics of revolution across the world. And yeah, just Google Rhythm Race Revolution if any of you are interested. And I also teach a short course at Goldsmiths called Bad Girls that looks at the representation of race, gender and sexuality in popular culture. Yeah, so there's lots of little things popping. But yeah, I'd like to know more about what everyone else is up to. What are you all writing about?
Amazing. Thank you so much. I guess 1 second. Yes, and over to Abraham.
Yeah, no, similar to Aditi, a lot of my stuff that I'm working on, I'm not allowed to talk about, so it's a watch this space. This has been the question actually in my life for the last 2 years, because my film was made 2 years ago, so now everyone's like, oh, this is great, what's next? The film is called No More Wings. You can watch it on YouTube. I've just put a link in the group for anyone who wants to watch it. In the chat box rather. But other than that, yeah, watch this space. As and when I'm allowed to talk about things, I'm very loud on social media, and I tell everyone, this is happening, this is that. So I'm particularly active on Instagram and Twitter, and my handle's the same on both, which is Abe is Legend. So if anyone wants to keep an eye on what's going on with me, as and when I can talk about things, I will. But I'm very excited for next year and being able to share a lot of the things that have been keeping me busy and will be keeping me busy next year. So yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And feel free to please drop your socials, Aditi and Abraham, in the chat group. And guys, that brings this wonderful session to a close. I just want to give a massive shout out. So if you can all join me in giving a very virtual round of applause to our 2 amazing speakers. And you guys have been absolutely amazing. Just to kind of remind everybody one last time that, of course, we have got the applications open for the grants, which I'll also put in the chat group. So please do check them out on toadymoon.com/apply. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully see you at the next session. Cheers.